All lines will be in a listen-only mode until the question-and-answer session. To ask your question, please press star 1. Today's conference is being recorded. If anyone has any objections, you may disconnect at this time. Now I'll turn the meeting over to Linda Abruzzi. You may begin.
Thank you, and good afternoon for those of you joining on the East Coast and West Coast. Thank you for joining us for a webinar on SNAP-R. I'm pleased to note that we have more than 30 people registered for this webinar today. My name is Linda Abruzzi. I'm an International Trade Specialist for the Marketing Communications Office for the U.S. Commercial Service at the Department of Commerce. This webinar is being brought to you in cooperation by the U.S. Foreign Commercial Service, and I'd like to welcome all the U.S. Commercial Service clients and other participants joining us from all across the USA to learn about SNAP-R. We are working with the Bureau of Industry and Security on a 9-webinar series of information that is important. We are also going to talk about in today's webinar how SNAP-R gives exporters the ability to submit all applications via the Internet in a secure environment, how the SNAP-R receives same-day acknowledgement of your submission and obtains online validations from the Bureau of Industry and Security. In a moment, I'll turn this presentation over to Angela Robinson, who is the Export Administration Specialist of the Outreach and Educational Service Division for the Bureau of Industry and Security. Angela Robinson will be available at the end of this presentation to answer your questions. Now, for those of you who just joined, you can still log into the webinar by entering the URL website and passcode per instructions that were sent to you by email. We do have a few housekeeping details to make sure everyone gets the benefit from this afternoon's webinar. You'll be able to hear this presentation via your telephone and view it simultaneously via your computer. So if you're not hooked up through both, please take a moment to do this. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please press star 1 anytime during this presentation. Now, we will be taking written and voice questions. To ask a written question, on the upper left-hand side of your computer is a box with the letters Q&A, which stand for questions and answers. If you would like to ask a written question, please type in your question under that icon. We will compile these questions and present them as many as time allows. Type questions which are not answered during this webinar will receive a personal answer via email afterwards. We will be taking also voice questions. To ask a voice question, please press star 1 on your telephone. Also, in addition, we do have a copy of this PowerPoint copies of PowerPoint presentation slides that are used for this webinar, and you can download these PowerPoint presentation slides by going to the icon on the upper right-hand side of your computer. The icon looks like 3 pieces of paper, one overlapping each other, and if you put your mouse cursor over that icon, you can actually download the PowerPoint presentation slides. And you will also see another handout there that is also important for this webinar. So please look at those and download those to computers. Both of those will be used for this afternoon's webinar. Now, for those of you who just joined us and logged in, you can still log into our Internet conference. And now I'd like to introduce live online our Export Administration Specialist of the Outreach and Educational Services Division for the Bureau of Industry and Security, Angela Robinson. Angela, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Linda. Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who've been with us through the beginning of this process, we began on Monday with the overview. We're going to continue the process. At this point, we're going to cover how to submit an application. In addition to that, we're also going to cover the application process. What happens to your application once it's submitted to the Bureau of Industry and Security, and give you an idea of what the time frame is based on statute. As she said, my name is Angela Robinson with the Outreach and Educational Services Division. I can be reached at 202-482-4811. When we began this program, we started out with the overview. We learned how to understand the Export Administration regulations and why we use the Export Administration regulations. From that next point, we learned about classifying our item, how to classify our item to determine whether or not we needed a license for the item to be exported from the U.S. We then covered the general prohibitions and end-user and end-use controls. We also covered license exceptions, and we've gotten to the point of support documentation. Now, in understanding that the export control classification number determines whether or not you need a license, and it's based on the reasons for control next in the box, as we've learned from the previous program. We now know and understand that there's an X in the box and there's no license exception available, which means that we must submit an application to the Bureau of Industry and Security to apply for a license. In order to apply for a license, BIS enacted a mandatory electronic filing for applications. These applications are for commodity classifications, export license, as well as re-export licenses. This was done in a benefit to all the export community. The benefit is that you can get same-day notification that the item was received by BIS. It eliminates those errors that in the previous would make us have to send your application back to you. If there was an error, we were required to send a complete application to you, and then you had to redo it and send it in again. Under SNAP-R, you have the fatal errors that won't allow you to continue if you've made a mistake. It's called the Simplified Network Application Process Redesign. To initially begin and participate as a SNAP-R user, you must first get a PIN request. In order to obtain a PIN request, which gives you a company's ID and a PIN number that allows you to enter into the system, you have to complete a company certification letter. As Linda said, the company certification letter has been provided for you as a handout to you along with your presentation slides. Basically, all you have to do is copy the company certification letter on your letterhead, fill in the document based on the questions that are being answered there, and once you've completed that, you can fax it in to our office at 202-219-9182. Company certification letter is required for all persons to participate in SNAP-R. Even if you are not a company, on the bottom of the document, you simply write, "I am not a company." That will ensure that it's still done through the same process. Right now, it's taking 5 to 10 business days for IDs and PINs to be returned to you. So give them that much time to do that. In addition, there's also the availability for you to submit a certification letter as a third-party filer. That's for those individuals who are consultants or lawyers who would submit the application on behalf of another party. For those individuals, that document is also on our website. You'll see the URL at the bottom of this particular slide. If you click on that, you will see that the company's third-party letter is there as well that you can copy and paste onto your letterhead. This next slide identifies on the website how the SNAP-R appears. It's the Simplified Network Application Process. You will see it identifies the PIN request, the company certification, and if you can see the full screen. You would also see that there's the third-party letter there as well. Upon receiving your PIN and ID, you would then log into the SNAP-R database. To log in, you initially will have to create a login ID and password. The reason for you to creating a login ID and password is so that we can ensure that it gives you another level of security. We don't want to be the only ones that have all the information. So this way it gives you an added security. Now, once you've created your login ID, you're in the system and you're ready to create your first work item. On the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see a list of items. In order to begin, you would select Create Work Item. Once you select that, you would see a drop box that indicates the type of application that you are submitting. You see there's an export license application, a re-export license application, an agricultural license exception notice, which is an AGR notice, as well as a commodity classification request. For those individuals wanting BIS to complete their classification of their item, which must be done prior to submitting an application. Remember, you can't submit a commodity classification and a license application at the same time. You must have the classification first, so you would not submit those two simultaneously. So once you've selected the type, as you can see, the next option is for the reference number. Now, the reference number is a number that's created by you as the applicant. You would create that reference number. It is used by you to track your application until such time it's been received electronically by BIS and been given a number that identifies it according to our system. So once it's been identified and picked up by the BIS system, you will then get an application control number. It's called an ACN. We use a lot of acronyms, but that's what it would be, an ACN, application control number. That number is identified and begins with a Z as in zebra. That's the number you would use beyond that point when you call BIS or at any time you have a question based on the process of your application status. You would use that application control number when you call to identify your application so that we can find it within the system. When you finish your application, once it's submitted, you wait 30 minutes upon submitting the application to the BIS. At that time, you would log back into your application, click on the link that opens up your reference number, and open up your application and look at the information that says acknowledgement and validation. Under that particular tab, you will see if there's any errors that have occurred which you need to complete and change. That means your application hasn't been done the process. If there's an error notice there, you have to change and complete that error message before it continues. If there are no error messages and it's been successfully accepted by BIS, then you will see your application control number. At any time you have any questions, you can always call Exporter Counseling at 202-482-4811. Something new that BIS has just enacted is the Stellar program, which is done via the web. Previously, you had to, or you could call in to find out and through the phone line to get the status of your application from Stellar. Well, Stellar has retired locally, so now we're using it on the web. If you go to the BIS website, you would see the image that says Stellar. If you click on that image, it will open up so that you can submit your application control number to get the status. Here is the way it appears on the website. You see where there's to put in your application control number. Once you put in there, it will give you the information regarding the status of your application. You can see whether it's pending here at BIS or whether it's pending at one of the other agencies, and then it won't tell you who the licensing officer is. Any further information than that, once again, you would call the Exporter Counseling Office, give the counselor the Z number, and they'll be glad to give you any information they have regarding your application and the status of that application. Okay, so we've gone through how to submit an application. Remember, it's a mandatory submission that will be done electronically. There are a few exceptions. Those exceptions you can find under Part 748.1. Basically, if you're a first-timer and you're only going to submit an application that one and only time and you have no intention of submitting another application, you can apply for the exception under that issue. There are some cases where there are very, very small companies that have limited participants and they don't have access for the Internet. If you could make a feasible case as to, why you don't have access, that would also be a reason why you would have an exemption from submitting electronically. Remembering in the previous presentation when it said only a person in the U.S. can apply for an export license. To apply for an export license, you must be in the U.S. If you are a foreign national and you are in the U.S., you're going to be here for 3 months. During that time, you found a few things that you want to send back home. Because you are in the U.S., you can apply for an export license. For your address, you would use the hotel or whatever facility which you are staying at. That would represent your address for the purpose of submitting the application. And as far as the information for anything else, you would use your passport information. Persons outside the U.S. may apply for a commodity classification, as well as a re-export license. Individuals who are foreign nationals or foreign companies who have products and they're actually sending their products here to the U.S. Eventually, those products come to the U.S. and they become part of the U.S. economy. At such time that wholly foreign-made item becomes part of the U.S. economy, it would be subject to the Export Administration regulations if someone decides that they want to export it outside the U.S. For those reasons, we do have the ability for foreign nationals to submit a commodity classification request for their items that have not yet arrived in the U.S. That option is available for individuals as well. And, of course, there is the re-export license. Remembering that a re-export license is required for those items that are subject to the Export Administration regulations wherever they're located. So if that item left the U.S. as an export and it was under an export license, the next destination from one foreign destination to another foreign destination is what constitutes the re-export. If that item would require a license based on the ECCN to that second country of destination, then that individual would apply for a re-export license through the SNAP-R program. Okay. So now we've talked about SNAP-R. We've talked about the Export Administration regulations, the application, and what you need to do in order to submit an application. What we're going to do now is talk about the process of the application once it's submitted to BIS. How the U.S. government processes your license application. Basically, there's a statute that we have to follow. It gives us a timeline. We try to adhere to that timeline as often as we can. But we all understand that things do happen, and there are things that happen on a daily basis, regulatory and otherwise, that may preclude us from actually meeting those specific timelines. We will do our best to meet those timelines when at all possible. What we're going to talk about is the BIS review, what happens when BIS initially receives your application, the interagency review, the process when it's here at BIS, the escalation procedure, what happens when everybody can't make a decision, and then, of course, we'll talk about the options regarding the final decision or the outcome of your application when it's submitted. First is the initial review and technical analysis. For every application that's submitted, you identify by a contact person, and that contact person would be the person that gives additional information. In the past, we've had several people that were identified as the contact person for a particular application, but had no information that was required when a question came up regarding the particulars of that transaction. It is to your benefit to ensure that the person listed as the contact person is the person that can answer specific questions about that particular transaction. That keeps the process going and won't put downtime in for your application. If you have more than one person that may call, or you want to have a backup for your application, we have summer, people take summer vacations in different times of the year, so someone else will be the one calling to find out the status or keeping track of the application in your absence. For that person, so that we can keep it moving along, it's to your benefit to add that person's name under the block identified as additional information. That would be under block 24 on the application. We do not divulge any information to any individual with the exception of the contact person that's on the application. So that way, when we look in our system, if there's additional persons that are allowed to have conversations about the application, and we can see their names listed, and we can freely answer their questions. So that takes away that time frame that you would have to fax in a notice stating that it's okay for that person to discuss the application. The next part is the verification of classification. Whenever the application is sent in, the next thing that's done is that the licensing officer that is assigned to the application will review the commodity classification. They will go over it and look at it to make sure that it is the exact classification for that particular item. In some cases, they may contact the contact person for additional information to ensure that the classification is correct. If there is a problem with the classification, that would be required for the individual to put the application to the side until the questions have been answered. The next bullet on the screen is return without action. Return without action means that the application is being sent because of a couple of things. One, it's being sent back because based on the fact that the licensing officer has reviewed the commodity classification that was identified on the application, it has been determined that the classification is in error. And the actual classification, export control classification number that represents that product is one that does not require a license. If it does not require a license, then the application will be returned without action, and it will be indicated that the item is not classified under this particular ECCN, but it's classified, and they'll identify the actual ECCN, and they will tell you that it is allowed to be sent based on the ECCN. It's either a no license required because there's no X in the box for the reasons for control, or it can be returned without action because based on that same information, remember when we go to the ECCN, we see the license exceptions that are available, and then there are also list-based, those are list-based license exceptions, but we also have the ones that are transactional-based. All those can be found in Part 740 of the Export Administration Regulations. So if your ECCN, based on the transaction identified on your application, if there is a license exception that would do the same thing, that would allow you to export your items in lieu of applying for a license, then your application will be returned without action, and it will be indicated on the notice that this particular item can be exported under the license exception, and they'll identify that license exception that can be used. The next part is referring to other agencies if required. Once again, based on the ECCN and the transaction itself, the licensing officer will determine if it needs to be reviewed by any other agencies. Those agencies include Department of Defense, Department of State, Department of Energy, Department of Justice, whichever agencies that the licensing officer deem appropriate. That will be done simultaneously. Each agencies will receive the referral on the same date. That particular time frame is 30 days. The interagency clearance, they have 30 days for that process. The next one is on hold without action. Your application was submitted. The licensing officer contacts you because they need some additional information. They get your voicemail. They're going to put your application on hold without action. They're going to try to send you a message through your SNAP account. Most things should be done through your SNAP account. So you want to check your SNAP account periodically to see if there's any messages or notices from the licensing officer about your application. When an application is put on hold without action, there's a limited amount of time. Generally, it's 10 to 15 days. Within that time frame, if the questions have not been resolved and the application is still on hold without action, the application will be returned without action because of the non-existent questions, because it was on hold for so long. It will be returned to you without action. It's returned without prejudice, and you do have an option of submitting a new application. Remember, if you submit a new application, you do have to start over from the beginning, and you have to create a new reference number. But the benefit of SNAP-R, which we didn't mention before, is that if you create a new license application, because you've already submitted the first application and you have that information within the system, you can reuse that information. you'll see a box that allows you, a button that allows you to reuse. And you can reuse any information from any application that you've submitted within SNAP. The next one is for approve or notify of attempt to deny. The application is either approved or you will be notified of an intent to deny the application, that your license will not be approved. At such time, you do have the ability to submit an appeal for that. You can appeal if your application was determined to be unlicensable or wasn't going to be approved. Interagency review. That's the review by other agencies. Remember, it's done simultaneously. You see Department of State, DOS, Department of Defense, DOE, DOD, Department of Energy, DOE, and Department of Justice. In addition to those, you see this says MTEC. That's the Missile Technology Export Control. It's chaired by the Department of State. Those items are controlled for missile technology reasons. If there's a specific missile technology reason, they would be the ones to check it. And we have SNEC, the Subgroup on Nuclear Export Coordination, which is also chaired by the Department of State. And those items are controlled for nuclear nonproliferation reasons. So then, of course, we have the SHIELD. Once again, it is also a group chaired by the Department of State. And those items are controlled for chemical biological reasons. The licensing officer will determine which agency, if it's one or two, however many that it may be, they will determine which agencies need to review the application. The process is 30 days. They have 30 days from the time that the application is submitted. They must provide regulatory basis for any denials that they have. If they say that they're going to deny your application for a particular reason, it must be solely based on the regulations, and we can be able to be found and supported by a regulatory issue. If no response is received from the interagency reviewers within 30 days, the IS would deem that to be no objection, and we will pull the application back, and we will indicate that no response was received, so therefore there was no objection from the agency involved. At that point, we will move forward with the application. This is the escalation process. Let's say that we've submitted the application. It's gone out for the interagency clearance. Everybody can't agree on the application. There seems to be some contention as to whether or not they want to approve the application. We have several processes to escalate this to see if we can get it approved. The first one is the operating committee. The operating committee is chaired by a career government employee. Each agency has a representative at that particular table. They will discuss it, and everybody will submit comments. The chair will take those comments and make a decision within 14 days. Upon making that decision, all parties have to agree on the decision. If all agencies do not agree with the outcome of the decision, then it will be escalated within 5 days to the ASAP. That's the Advisory Committee on Export Policy. That particular body is chaired by an appointed official. It would be the Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Administrative Security and his counterparts for each corresponding agency. Once again, they go through the same process. They meet, they discuss, and they come up with comments. Those comments are put together, and a decision is made by the chair within 11 days. If they cannot come to a consensus for that particular application, then once again, they have the ability to escalate it to the next level. That's done within 5 days, and then it's escalated to the Export Administration Review Board, or the EARB. Now, the EARB is chaired by the Secretary of each agency. That's the Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and so on. All parties represented at the table. Once again, they'll have a discussion based on regulatory basis, and they will come up with comments, and the chair will make a decision. If all parties cannot agree on that decision within, that is 14 days, then once again, they have the ability to escalate that item to the next level. And as you can see, there's no bullet for that next level. The next level is actually the President of the United States. And to 20 years that I've been here, I've never seen the President become a licensing officer. And I don't see that anyone would like to make that kind of career move to make him a licensing officer. Next comes the final decision. These are the possible outcomes for any application. An application can be returned without action. Remember, the return without action is based on the fact that the classification was in error and the item either doesn't require a license or there's a license exception available. It can be approved with conditions. If the application has conditions, once it's sent out for the interagency, it comes back. All information is comprised together, and there's a set of conditions that are developed based on all agencies' comments. Those conditions are sent out to the applicant in advance of the approval. Please review the conditions prior to accepting the license. Once the license has been approved with those conditions, it makes it harder to make changes. It gives you that option at that time just to go back and say, well, this condition may be a little harsh, or this condition is not workable for this particular transaction, so that you can see if there's any options. Once you've agreed to the conditions, then the application is approved. We've started on May 5th, beginning May 5th of this year. In the past, we've sent out hard copies of licenses once they were approved. Because of the Paper Reduction Act, and we want to participate, licenses will no longer be mailed out. You have the ability to print your license via your SNAP account. All you have to do is click on Validations and Acknowledgments, and you'll see a link that has your license. And when you print it, it'll appear the same as if you had the hard copy mailed to you. Next is the denial. In some cases, the application would be denied. If it's denied, you do have the option of appealing the ruling. You can appeal by submitting information to the Undersecretary for the Export Administration and for the Bureau of Industry and Security, and they will determine, based on that information, and make a decision in terms of your application. Once your application is approved, it's written in stone. Actually, it's not. There are some things that may change once the application is approved. Under 750.7, you'll find what's listed as non-material changes. There are several non-material changes. If whatever is transpiring for your transaction is listed under 750.7 as a non-material change, then you do not have to submit for a replacement license. If your particular situation is not listed under 750.7 and does not constitute a non-material change, then you must submit a replacement license, which essentially means you must submit a new application. You can reference the previous one that was approved prior to that, and you can use the data from that other application. Remember, you can reuse the data. Applications are valid for a 2-year period. You have 2 years to submit. You have 2 years to submit to export those items to that destination, to that end user. So keeping that in mind when you submit your initial application, if you have an item that you're sending to a customer and you have an idea that during the next 2-year period they may want several more, you may want to include that on your application initially. So instead of submitting an application for that one item, you would do it for 5. So you have 2 years. If you don't ship, that's okay. You don't have to send it back to us and say, I didn't send these. When it expires, that's it. But you have that 2-year period for that item, to that destination, to that end user, for that end use. It's based on the face of the license. You can also, in some cases, get it an extended validity when you submit your applications. There are some transactions that call for a longer period, that maybe this particular transaction or this venture you're going into is going to be for 4 years. At the time that you submit your application, you can ask for an extended validity period based on your transaction, and that will be taken into consideration. And you can find more information about that under Part 750.7 of the regulations. Now, with all that being said, remember this is the steps for the license review process. There's the final decision, or we'll start at the bottom, not at the top. You submit your application. You're going to submit your application through SNAP-R. The initial analysis, the licensing officer is going to review your application. That initial review for everything they need to do is actually 14 days. That's based on statute. They're going to conduct a technical review, technical and policy review. They're going to conduct the interagency clearance. That process is 30 days. If there's a non-consensus in terms of whether or not the application should be approved, then it's escalated to the various chaired agencies, chaired bodies. And, of course, and we hope for everyone, is the final decision where you have your application and it is approved. Basically, for all things, you want to remember everything is based on the export control classification number. Remember we said in the beginning, our jurisdiction may be, our information is broad, but our jurisdiction, it's a narrow group of information or a narrow group of items that require a license. It's only 2 to 5% of all items that leave the U.S. that require a license. But in all that, making sure that you understand the classification, which is the driving force for the transaction. Okay, with that being said, that's the end of my talk. So I will turn the phone and the seminar back over to Linda.
Thank you, Angela. And now we'll open the telephone lines for voice questions. If you have a voice question, please press *1. Operator.
Thank you. Once again, if you have a question, please press *1. You will be announced prior to asking your question. To withdraw your question, press *2. Once again, if you have a question, it's *1. At this time, I'm not showing any questions.
Okay, we're going to go with part of our written questions. I have a question here from Beverly Yoakum. The question is, for steps 1 through 6 of the license review process, what would be the longest time and shortest time to complete?
Beverly, actually, there's no one way to give you an answer. Remember, by statute, it says 39 days, and we try to adhere to that 39-day process. The longest I've seen is 6 months. The shortest I've seen is 4 weeks. It's actually on a case-by-case basis, so there's no real definite time frame I can give you. But I generally tell people when they call the counseling line, if you're submitting an application and you want to do it based on the contract, build in 120 days on your contract. That way it's easier to say you've done it in advance rather than going back to get additional time. But on average, it takes about 45 to 50 days. That's the closest I can get you in terms of giving it a time frame. Thank you.
Okay, great. And just as a reminder, if you need to have or you have additional questions, you can always call that number for expert counseling at 202-482-4811. That's how you can also reach Angela. I'm going to open up the lines one more time for voice questions. Also, if you have a written question, please submit it on the upper left-hand side of your computer screen. There's an icon with the letters Q&A for question and answer, and then we can answer your specific questions. So, operator, one more time for voice questions.
Thank you. Once again, it is star one for your question. This time I'm not showing any questions.
Okay, well then let's go on to another question I have in the written portion. What type of information should be submitted to verify the ECCN? This is from Nancy Quintana.
Nancy, to do the commodity classifications, what we would need would be the technical specifications that identify your product, any descriptive literature, sales brochures, anything you have describing the product. The more information, the faster the time frame. But that's what we would need to do a commodity classification.
Okay, we also have a gentleman here. His name is Andre Smith, and he is an expert with the technical information on SNAP-R. So if you have any technical questions, please take advantage of this time to also ask him. He is here with Angela. And I'd also like to remind everybody that this is the 7th of the series of 9 webinars, and we've covered the SNAP-R. And that also, if you are still interested in learning more about our other 2 topics, which are the export clearance and records and the export management compliance, both of those webinars will be presented tomorrow. The export clearance and records will be in the morning from 11 to 12. The export management compliance will be in the afternoon from 2 to 3. So this series is it was a 2-day conference the Bureau of Industry and Security usually shows and presents, but we are condensing it into a 9 one-hour webinar series. So please take advantage of this time to ask Angela or Andre, for any questions that you might have in relation to this topic. This is very technical and very in-depth and a little bit complex. So if you have any more questions, one more time for any open-ended questions. If not, we'll conclude this webinar. Operator?
Once again, it is star one. Not showing any questions.
Okay, last question here from the written part. Jean Burkhead, are there any pending changes coming soon to this online SNAP-R system? Andre.
Currently, the only thing that we're looking forward to in the near future would be online registration. SNAP-R is currently about to implement new online registration, which will include the PIN and SIN registration. That's the most current changes that's probably going to be coming shortly.
Okay, and how can they get in contact with you? Is it still the same number, 202-482-4811?
That is correct.
Okay, and your name again is?
Andre Smith.
Okay, great. Okay, well then, that concludes our webinar and presentation. Angela has one more thing to say.
Just for the overview for the announcement, there is the final program, which is going to be held Thursday at 2 o'clock, is the Export Management Compliance Program. That is a program which will allow you to create an internal control program that will encompass all the information that we've covered in all these seminars. Basically, it's a lot of information. So what you want to do is find a way to put it all together so that it will be a process that will help you stay in compliance with the regulations. It is not a mandatory program, but it is something that allows for mitigating factors if there's an error that may take place. So this will be done on Friday at 2 o'clock. So I encourage anyone who has a need or who is participating in exporting to participate in that program to find out how to create a compliance program that will help you stay in compliance, not only with the Bureau of Industry and Securities regulations, but it's not set for any particular agency, and you can take that information and also use it for other agencies as well.
And a way to register for that webinar for tomorrow, the Export Management Compliance webinar that Angela was talking about, you can go onto the U.S. Commercial Services website at www.export.gov, and in the bottom part of that website, there is a link that indicates the Bureau of Industry's webinar series, and you can register for that particular webinar in that link. And it is still open, so we are still accepting registrants, so please take advantage of this. Well, everybody, I'd like to thank you for your participation. It's of great value to us, and I hope we've answered all your questions and provided the value to you. I'd also like to let you know that if you do have any additional questions that might occur to you afterwards, you can please call that 202-482-4811 number, and export counselors will be able to help you. I'd like to thank you again for your participation, and thank Angela Robinson and Andre Smith for his and her expertise for today's webinar. Please note that there are these websites at www.bis.doc.gov and www.export.gov for export counseling on international and upcoming events. Thank you, everybody, and goodbye.